After the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the world was never the same. The catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons witnessed in Japan led to a single conclusion: such weapons should never be used again. The world adhered to this consensus for almost 80 years. The so-called nuclear taboo became somewhat of an unbreakable vow, a silent, resounding pledge to humanity's survival. That is, until Russia's President Vladimir Putin demonstrated a troubling willingness to breach this nuclear taboo. The potential use of nuclear weapons in conflict has been all anyone can talk about since the beginning of Russia's violent invasion of Ukraine. Chief among those watching intently is the group that can actually do something about a potential nuclear war: the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Though NATO has long been acutely aware of a nuclear threat, 2022 was the first time in decades that meetings were actively held to discuss the unthinkable, a nuclear conflict. So what will NATO do to stop the most devastating weapon the world has ever seen? Though NATO hasn't exactly been forthcoming with its plans, the key strategies can be inferred from the organization's actions in recent years. With this in mind, let's break down NATO's nuclear war plan and hope the final strategy remains forever unused. Broadly speaking, the stages in NATO's nuclear plan can be broken into three categories. 1. Nuclear war is just a hypothetical possibility. 2. Nuclear war is looming on the horizon. And 3. Nuclear war is here. Stage 1 under Category 1 is enhanced deterrence. Now, this probably isn't surprising to anyone who's followed NATO's nuclear stance over the years, as nuclear deterrence has always been a core component of the alliance's strategy. Though critics feared that this approach might lead to nuclear proliferation, NATO's always been clear about one thing: as long as nuclear weapons exist, it'll remain a nuclear alliance. But what does NATO's nuclear deterrence actually entail? For those unfamiliar with the term, nuclear deterrence is a strategy aimed at preventing an adversary from using nuclear weapons by convincing them that the costs and risks of such an action outweigh the potential benefits. NATO has been employing this strategy since its inception, as the organization was essentially created to counter the Soviet Union's military threat. Interestingly, the Soviet Union test-fired its first nuclear device some 5 months after NATO was established. During the Cold War, NATO's nuclear strategy was based on pure nuclear deterrence, dissuading the Soviet Union from launching any attacks on NATO territory. However, there were also some proponents of a mixed nuclear and conventional deterrence strategy, in which only major acts of aggression would be met with an all-out nuclear response. For minor aggression, on the other hand, conventional defense methods would be employed. However, given how overwhelmingly powerful the Soviet Union's conventional forces were at the time, NATO had also to consider the use of nuclear weapons to respond to major conventional aggression. Though this nuclear doctrine of massive retaliation was later revised, NATO still reserves the right to use nuclear weapons first under the so-called Flexible Response Defense Strategy. The Flexible Response Strategy was adopted in December 1967 after years of debating it. This strategy dictates that any aggression short of a general nuclear attack is to be responded to at a level of force at which it was initiated, a sort of eye for an eye approach. However, NATO also retained the option to introduce nuclear weapons into the conflict first if the initial response failed to contain the aggressor. In other words, NATO has the green light to deliberately escalate virtually any conflict to general nuclear war if the circumstances warrant such an action. Since nuclear first use was still very much on the table, NATO began to stockpile nuclear weapons in Europe to ensure readiness. By the 70s, there were roughly 7,400 nuclear weapons stored across Europe, including the following: nuclear-armed missiles, surface-to-air missiles, air-to-surface missiles, air-delivered gravity bombs, anti-submarine depth bombs, special atomic demolition munitions, and nuclear artillery shells. This brings us to another prominent strategy under the first category of NATO's nuclear war plan: increased military readiness. The goal is to build and maintain military capabilities in such a manner that a would-be aggressor is dissuaded from attacking due to the sheer force of the potential counterattack. Throughout history, NATO mostly tailored these efforts to the Soviet Union's actions. For instance, when the Soviet Union started modernizing its intermediate-range nuclear missile force by introducing the SS-20 missile that could carry 3 independently targeted warheads, NATO adopted a modernization plan of its own. The plan involved building the capabilities for deploying 572 tactical nuclear warheads on ground-launched cruise missiles and Pershing II ballistic missiles. As things stand today, it seems nothing has changed in this regard. The only difference is that NATO is now dealing with Russia and not the Soviet Union, though to be fair, it's still pretty much the same. NATO has once again been forced to significantly strengthen its deterrence posture and invest substantial effort into boosting its military readiness. However, it's important to note that NATO doesn't possess any nuclear weapons or military forces directly. The organization's military readiness is currently based on the nuclear force of a single member state, the US. To be fair, France and the UK also play an important deterrent role and contribute to NATO's overall security. However, the bulk of NATO's nuclear readiness relies on the US's extensive capabilities and strategic assets. That's where the supreme guarantee of NATO's security comes from. But having more than one nuclear force under its wing is a huge plus for NATO, and not just because of the number of weapons these states bring to the mix. No, having several different centers of decision-making has a huge strategic importance. It complicates the adversary's calculations. What do we mean by that? Well, it's simple, really. If an adversary decides to introduce nuclear weapons to a conflict, they must first consider the response not just from NATO but 3 separate nuclear-armed states within the alliance. And one of those 3 states is one of the most powerful nuclear nations in the world. Simply calling the US a nuclear-armed state might be the understatement of the century, as the country possesses over 5,500 warheads in its nuclear arsenal. The only country to have more is Russia, with over 6,000. Some of these warheads are stored in Europe as part of NATO's increased military readiness strategy. However, it's important to note that the stockpiling of nuclear weapons intensified once again after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Before that, in the early 1990s, NATO's European-based nuclear arsenal was voluntarily reduced to about 4,000 tactical warheads. This number was even lowered by the decade's end, with many ground-based and sea-based tactical weapons being withdrawn from Europe. For instance, there were only about 400 air-delivered gravity bombs left in NATO's European arsenal. But the 1990s have long passed. Together with the fragile peace ushered in by the dissolution of the Soviet Union, in the 2020s the word peace is increasingly elusive, overshadowed with the resurgence of geopolitical tensions. In other words, a strong European-based nuclear arsenal is once again a must. Though the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons signed by all states mentioned in the video calls for transparency on nuclear weapons holding, NATO hasn't disclosed how many weapons there are in Europe currently and where they're stored. The only well-known fact is that the central military assets in NATO's European arsenal are the B-61 thermonuclear gravity bomb and the dual-capable aircraft equipped to carry this bomb. It's also known that NATO follows strict procedures to guarantee security of these weapons at all times. Given how important and powerful these weapons are, this shouldn't come as a surprise. The B-61 is a tactical nuclear weapon with a variable yield. This means its explosive power can be adjusted depending on the scenario. The yield range of the B-61 is said to be between 0.3 and 340 kilotons. To put that figure into perspective, the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had a yield of 15 and 21 kilotons respectively. Simply put, there is nothing this nuclear bomb can't do. In the event of a nuclear conflict, this bomb would be carried by dual-capable aircraft while supported by conventional military forces from across NATO. However, as the name suggests, dual-capable aircraft can do more than just carry nuclear weapons in conflict. This is just their role at the highest level of escalation. These aircraft can also be used for other roles at various readiness levels, such as reconnaissance, air policing, and conventional strike missions. That's why these aircraft were given to NATO by various members, beyond the 3 considered to be nuclear states. This transaction of weapons is covered by nuclear sharing arrangements, which is another important pillar of NATO's nuclear strategy. Technically, the goal of these arrangements is to provide military support for NATO's nuclear capabilities and ensure the interconnection of the alliance. However, they also have an additional, more symbolic meaning. The nuclear sharing arrangements demonstrate unwavering unity and an unbreakable bond between NATO member states, which are seen as a testament to the alliance's strength and resolve in the face of any threat. However, it's not enough to demonstrate this strength only in theory. Nuclear deterrence can't be based on a bluff. NATO must also show just how ready it is for a potential nuclear conflict. And that's where nuclear exercises come into play. These exercises are also the last strategy covered by the first category of NATO's nuclear war plan: prevention. NATO conducts regular nuclear exercises to ensure and demonstrate the credibility, effectiveness, and security of its nuclear deterrent missions. Chief among them is Steadfast Noon, the annual exercise conducted for over a decade with a different host every year. During Steadfast Noon, nuclear-capable fighter aircraft simulate the procedures and protocols involved in a nuclear strike mission without actually carrying live bombs. It's important to emphasize that Steadfast Noon isn't linked to current world events, but try telling that to Russia. After the 2023 Steadfast Noon exercise in Italy and Croatia, the then Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu accused the U.S. of a steady escalation, warning of the threat of direct military clashes between nuclear powers. The exercise that caused all this ruckus lasted 10 days and involved 13 NATO allies and over 60 fighter aircraft. The sheer magnitude of the 2023 Steadfast Noon probably alarmed Russia despite the training being held at least 600 miles from Russia's borders. But threats of nuclear destruction coming from Russia are nothing new. In fact, they are the reason why we're familiar with the second category of NATO's nuclear war plan: strategies employed when a nuclear war might be too close for comfort. Stage 1 in this category is recognizing imminent danger. Incessant, empty threats are one thing, but the actual possibility of a nuclear catastrophe is entirely different. Unfortunately, this possibility seemed highly likely in 2022 when it was concluded that Russia might be planning to employ tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. As a response, urgent meetings were held to discuss the harrowing reality of nuclear brinksmanship. The problem with employing tactical nuclear weapons is they can be easily transported across the country and fired from existing conventional systems stationed at the Ukrainian battlefield. After all, we aren't talking about a strategic nuclear weapon capable of laying entire cities to waste. So after Stage 1, recognizing the threat, comes Stage 2, communicating warnings. The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken did just that with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Meanwhile, Mark Milley, the U.S. chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, contacted his Russian counterpart, General Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces. Then CIA Director William Burns was sent to speak to Sergei Naryshkin, head of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service. However, given the gravity of the situation, it wasn't enough for the warnings to only come from NATO, which states like Russia see as the enemy. This is why NATO also reached out to non-allies such as India and China and enlisted their help. This can be considered Stage 3 of the second category of NATO's nuclear plan. The stage aims to get the countries close to the potential aggressor to join in the efforts to discourage a nuclear attack. For this to happen, these countries must first be convinced of the potential catastrophic consequences of such an attack. But keep in mind that we're still talking about non-allies. That's why a part of the convincing strategy must include some concessions for the interests of the non-allies, showing them that cooperation is in their best interest. In the case of China and India, the plan seems to have worked, as the nuclear scare of 2022 didn't turn into a nuclear conflict as we now know. There hasn't been a similar scare since, but NATO remains vigilant at the same time. Ideally, a nuclear scare would remain the worst-case scenario. After all parties should be aware a nuclear war can't be won, and as such should never be fought. That's precisely what NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg reminded Russia in late 2022. Similarly, President Joe Biden equated a potential nuclear war to Armageddon. However, as things stand, a nuclear war can't be considered an impossibility. With this in mind, let's discuss what NATO's nuclear war plan might entail if nuclear weapons are used. The use of the word might is very intentional, as NATO has purposefully kept the details of a potential response vague. There's always talk about severe consequences, but never any discussion of what these consequences truly are. Why? Because the US and in turn NATO have long stuck to the policy of strategic ambiguity. Essentially, this policy allows policymakers to decide how to respond on a case-by-case basis. In this case, leaving out the specifics of a nuclear response may serve as a more potent deterrent than any explicit plan ever could. But this probably doesn't make you any less interested in the final stage of NATO's nuclear war plan. So let's discuss Stage 3, the list of actions NATO could take in the event of a nuclear conflict. First things first, any such action would have to be explicitly approved by NATO's Nuclear Planning Group, or NPG. The NPG is in charge of all aspects of NATO's nuclear mission, so this body would play a crucial role in determining the course of action in such a dire scenario. The reported list of actions considered in the Russian scenario includes striking the Russian forces and equipment in Ukraine with missiles and sinking the Black Sea Fleet. From this, we can infer that the final stage of NATO's nuclear plan involves swift, devastating, and overwhelming responses aimed at neutralizing the adversary's military capabilities. Further possible actions include cutting out communications with electronic warfare and arranging a comprehensive cyber blackout. From these actions alone, we can conclude that the goal at the final stage of NATO's nuclear plan is to immediately terminate the aggression and eliminate any possibility of retaliation and further escalation. Now, it's almost impossible to say whether these actions would truly lead to the intended outcome, especially if the adversary in question is Russia, the country with the highest number of nuclear warheads in the world. However, just because other countries possess fewer nuclear weapons than Russia doesn't make them any less dangerous. Some security experts believe that the biggest threats in the coming years will come from rogue states, regional dictators, and sub-national groups. However, these potential attacks should be swiftly neutralized with conventional force as long as the threat is identified in time. The countries that could pose more of a challenge in this department include China, North Korea, and Iran. Though China does have an official no-first-use policy, the country has been growing its nuclear arsenal at quite an accelerated and alarming rate in the last few years. These efforts likely reflect China's changing perception of the international environment, in which the country is increasingly perceived as a threat. Given Beijing's relentless efforts to reshape the global dynamics, no action, however extreme, can be written off. As for North Korea and Iran, it seems that the countries have been closely monitoring how NATO acted and still does when faced with nuclear coercion. As new global conflicts keep emerging, these nations might see them as an opportunity to advance their nuclear ambitions. But how do things currently stand? Well, North Korea has been rather busy in the last few years. Since 2020, the country has conducted hundreds of so-called test launches of its ballistic missiles aimed at intimidating the US and South Korea. North Korea was also the last country to conduct a nuclear test in recent history. The test in question took place in 2017 at the Punggye nuclear test site and involved a hydrogen bomb with a 250 kiloton yield. North Korea is reportedly planning another nuclear test as its leader Kim Jong-un renounced the country's former commitment to denuclearization publicly and unequivocally. This, of course, is a significant problem, as according to various reports, North Korea could possess as many as 116 nuclear weapons as of 2024. Though Iran isn't known to currently possess any weapons of mass destruction, the country's nuclear program is subject to international concern and scrutiny, especially regarding its potential military applications. Given that Iran, much like North Korea and China, sees the US, arguably the most prominent NATO member, as the enemy, the alliance's nuclear war plan might need to be implemented for any of these countries. For now, Stage 1 nuclear deterrence applies to all of these countries. Hopefully, there will be no need to reach any subsequent stages in the near future. Unfortunately, as far as Russia goes, NATO still can't relax. Though there haven't been any major nuclear scares since late 2022, the recent development in Ukraine might necessitate another implementation of the more advanced strategies of NATO's nuclear plan. You see, in March 2024, 4 NATO members, Canada, France, Lithuania, and the Netherlands, stated that they were considering sending troops to combat Russia in Ukraine. As you can imagine, Putin wasn't exactly thrilled by the statements. In fact, his exact words were, "Western nations think this is some kind of game. They are blinded by their own superiority complex." He added that Russia too has weapons that can hit targets on their territory, which would undoubtedly lead to a conflict with the use of nuclear weapons and the destruction of civilization. Still, as of May 2024, these countries haven't ruled out sending combat troops to Ukraine, which means a potential nuclear escalation can't be ruled out as well. Now, there are 2 opposing schools of thought concerning this new threat of nuclear war. The first believes that NATO mustn't be deterred by the possibility of escalation, as bowing to Russia's nuclear blackmail can only make a nuclear war more possible. However, the second school of thought argues that calling Putin on his bluff can only incite the dictator, pushing him to react aggressively. Those same experts point out the flaws in NATO's nuclear war plan, making the alliance's bold actions much more reckless. According to these critics, virtually every stage of this plan could use some work. For starters, they claim NATO's current posture of flexible response lacks military and strategic rationale. On one hand, it directly contradicts NATO's commitment not to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear states. On the other, it weakens the nuclear non-proliferation regime, which could encourage more countries to develop their nuclear arsenals. After all, if NATO can essentially do whatever it wants, why shouldn't other nations follow suit? Critics believe that NATO should pledge not to be the first to introduce nuclear weapons into a conflict, as this would reduce the military attractiveness and potential acceptability of these weapons. The next stage of NATO's nuclear plan, military readiness, is also criticized by some experts. They claim that NATO's dual-capable aircraft are in desperate need of modernization. While the process is carried out, NATO should do everything in its power to increase the survivability of the existing aircraft. Though the B-61 bombs aren't as outdated, they could even use upgrades that complement the aircraft modernization program. Even NATO's nuclear exercises are criticized as unrealistic, deeming them as nothing more than a show, a symbolic gesture rather than practical preparation. And if NATO doesn't engage in realistic planning of a nuclear action on a regular basis, how can the alliance expect to successfully conduct the final stage of its plan? According to critics, it can't. Now check out German intelligence warns Russian attack on NATO by this year, or watch this video instead.